Chapter 1. The chains cut into my wrists before I even understand why I am kneeling. Guards press my shoulders down. Governor Wexler's voice rings out somewhere above me, calling me a poisoner, a traitor, a nobody who dared touch a king. I lift my head and find Beckett watching me from his high seat, his face carved from stone, and I think, this is the same mouth that once thanked me for half a loaf of bread. 3 weeks ago I did not know his name was a lie. 3 weeks ago I only knew I had one loaf left, and a brother to feed, and a debt collector standing between me and both. That morning the frost had not yet burned off the shutters of my stall when Governor Thayer Wexler walked up with 2 enforcers at his back. He smiled the way men smile when they already know they've won. He told me the stall fee had gone up again. I told him I'd paid it yesterday. He told me yesterday's rate no longer applied. I reached for my coin purse because arguing with a man who owns the guards is not bravery. It's stupidity, and I have a 16-year-old brother at home who needs me alive more than he needs me proud. Wexler took the coins, counted them slow enough to humiliate me, and then, for no reason except that he could, he stepped on my last good loaf and ground it under his boot. Packless Omegas should be grateful they're allowed a stall at all, he said, and walked off like he'd done me a kindness. I looked down at the ruined bread and did the math I always do. 1 loaf left, 1 brother. 1 stomach that would have to wait until tomorrow so his wouldn't. That's when I saw the stranger under the clock tower. He looked like the wind had been chewing on him for a week. Coat torn at the shoulder, boots caked in mud, a beard grown in patches like he hadn't seen a blade in days. Any other morning I would have felt sorry for him and moved on, because pity doesn't fill an oven or pay a debt. But something about him didn't sit right. His boots were ruined, yes, but underneath the mud they were stitched with thread too fine for a beggar. His hands, when he shifted, showed scars that don't come from farm work or hunger. They come from a blade meeting a blade, over and over until the body learns how to survive it. And he wasn't watching the street the way a starving man watches for scraps. He was watching the rooftops, the alley mouths, the 2 men across the road who were trying very hard to look like they weren't watching him back. I knew he was lying about who he was before he ever opened his mouth. I split my last loaf anyway. He looked at the bread in my hand like it might be a trick. "Can you afford to give this away?" "No," I said. "That doesn't mean I get to watch you starve because it's convenient for me." Something moved behind his eyes then, quick and involuntary, like a door blown open by wind he hadn't meant to let in. For 1 heartbeat the mask slipped, and a scent hit me that I felt in my chest before my brain caught up to it. Winter cedar, cold iron, something underneath both that felt less like a smell and more like a memory I hadn't made yet. My pulse did something it had no business doing over a stranger who might be dangerous. He noticed. I could tell by the way his jaw tightened, the way he pulled the scent back down like tucking a knife back into a sleeve. "What do they call you?" he asked, and his voice had gone rougher, like he was fighting to keep it steady. "Arden," I said, before I remembered that giving your name to a man who might be a hired blade is not a smart habit. He didn't offer his own. He said only, "Beck." And even that felt like half a truth wearing the other half's coat. He ate slowly, like a man savoring something that wasn't food at all. When he left, he didn't thank me the way hungry men usually do, loud and grateful and gone. He walked backward for 3 steps first, like he couldn't make himself stop looking at me, and then he turned the corner and was gone into the crowd like smoke finding a crack in a door. I went back to my stall and told myself it meant nothing. Then I heard it. One of the 2 men across the street, the ones who'd been pretending not to watch, said something under his breath to the other as they turned to follow him. 2 words, quiet enough that I almost missed them, clear enough that I never will. "Your Majesty." Chapter 2. He came back the next morning like nothing had happened, and I stood there holding a copper coin he just placed on my counter, trying to decide if I'd imagined the 2 words I heard the day before. "1 loaf," he said, same as any customer, like he hadn't just made my whole night sleepless. I didn't hand it over right away. "Somebody called you Majesty yesterday." His face didn't move. That was the tell. A real stranger would have laughed or looked confused or asked what I was talking about. He just held very still, the way a man holds still when he's deciding how much of the truth he can afford to spend. "He said mastery," Beck said finally. "I trained with the guard. People mishear things. It was a clean lie. Too clean. The kind you build in advance, not the kind you invent on the spot. I gave him the bread anyway, because I am apparently the kind of fool who feeds a man even while I'm counting the ways he's deceiving me. He turned to go, then paused and said, "Thank you, Arden." I never told him my name a second time. I definitely never told him yesterday morning either, not out loud where a stranger passing through could catch it. "How do you know that?" "Wexler said it," he answered, too fast. "Except Wexler never calls me anything but Omega. Like my name is a luxury I haven't earned." I've heard him say it 100 times, always with that same curl of contempt. Never once has he used the word Arden. I filed it away with everything else that didn't add up about this man, the way I file every receipt and every missing sack of flour, because someday all these small wrong numbers add up to one big truth. He returned the following day too, and the day after that, always at the same hour, always with a question that had nothing to do with bread. Which farms had stopped delivering grain? Which families had gone quiet after complaining to the district office? Whether Omegas without a sponsoring Alpha could still get a ration card? I told him I wasn't in the business of handing out information to a man who wouldn't tell me his own name. He looked almost pleased that I'd refused him, which was strange, because most men don't enjoy being told no. That was the day Garrick grabbed my wrist. He's a merchant, drunk most afternoons, handsy on the ones when his wife isn't watching. He closed his fingers around my arm and pulled hard enough that pain shot up to my shoulder, and before I could yank free, Beck's hand was already around Garrick's wrist, moving so fast I never saw it start. "Release him," Beck said, quiet, almost gentle. Garrick's whole body folded. His eyes dropped. His throat bared itself in submission before his brain seemed to catch up with what his body had already decided to do. I've seen alphas throw punches to get that kind of surrender. I've never seen one get it with 3 words and a still hand. Beck let him go the second Garrick backed off. He didn't hit him. He didn't gloat. He turned straight to me, checking my wrist without touching it first, waiting. "May I look?" he asked. Nobody asks me that. Not Wexler's men. Not the merchants who think a stall girl's arm is theirs to grab. Not even the healers who've patched me up before. They just take what they want and call it help. I let him look. His fingers hovered over the bruise like he was afraid of adding to it. His scent slipped its leash again for half a second, and my whole body leaned toward him before my mind caught up and yanked it back. I stepped away first. I had to. That night, turning his copper coin over in my hands by candlelight, I noticed something I'd missed every time before. Along the rim, worn thin but still there if you knew to look, sat the faint edge of a wolf circling a crown. I have never once seen a coin like it anywhere in Cedar Hollow. It isn't currency anyone here is allowed to spend. Chapter 3. I started keeping a ledger of every question Beck asked me, the same way I keep a ledger of flour and coin, because a man who studies corruption this closely either wants to end it or wants to profit from knowing exactly how it works. Hollis noticed the extra loaf I'd started setting aside each morning before he noticed much else. He's 16, which means he notices everything about my life except the parts that would actually help him understand it. "You're blushing over the beggar," he said, grinning around a mouthful of bread. "I am not," I said, which was a lie, and he knew it, and neither of us said anything else about it because there wasn't time. A man came to the stall an hour later carrying a child on each hip, his face gray with the kind of exhaustion that comes from going hungry on purpose so your kids don't have to. His ration card had been refused. No sponsoring Alpha, the clerk had told him. Packless households don't qualify. I gave him bread on credit I knew he'd never be able to repay. Beck was standing close enough to hear the whole exchange, and something happened to his face that I hadn't seen before. Not pity. Fury, banked low and controlled, aimed at nothing in the room and everything outside it. "That requirement is illegal," he said once the man had gone. "Laws mean nothing when the people enforcing them profit from breaking them," I told him. "Then someone should report it." I pointed across the square at 3 shuttered storefronts, dust thick on their windows. "Those families reported it. Ask where they are now." He went quiet in a way that told me the answer mattered to him more than he wanted it to. Later that day, I rode with him to deliver bread to a farmer who'd broken his leg falling from a ladder no landlord would fix. The wagon rattled over ruts in the road, and somewhere between the 2nd and 3rd mile, Beck asked me why I kept giving bread away I couldn't afford to lose. I told him about my mother, how she used to say rosemary was for remembrance, how every loaf I bake still carries a little of her in it whether the person eating it knows that or not. He told me, slow, like it cost him something to say out loud, that he'd never once known whether the people around him cared about him or about what he could give them. Then maybe, I said, you should stop hiding behind the mask and blaming everyone for only seeing it. He looked at me like I'd struck him somewhere he didn't know was still tender. The wagon hit a hole in the road hard enough to throw me sideways, and his arm caught me around the waist before I could fall. For one long second, neither of us moved. His scent broke through the suppressant again, stronger this time, and mine answered it without my permission. He let go like the contact had burned him. His hands were shaking. I understood then that whatever this man was hiding, indifference wasn't part of it. We were almost back to the bakery when I noticed the black line someone had painted across my door, still wet, dripping down the wood like a wound. Beck went rigid the second he saw it. That's a warning, he said. It means someone's marked you for killing. I asked him how he knew that with such certainty, and he wouldn't answer, and that refusal frightened me more than the mark itself. That night, hiding behind a stack of grain sacks near the warehouse where I sometimes go to think, I heard two of Wexler's enforcers talking low, thinking no one could hear them. The king may have hidden his crown, one of them said, but he's already chosen what he can't afford to lose. The other one laughed, quiet and ugly. Then we used the Omega. Chapter 4. The bakery had been torn apart by the time I got home. Flour sacks slit open and left to bleed white across the floor. Furniture flipped. My mother's recipe book, the one I keep behind the third loose brick by the oven, gone. Nothing valuable was taken. Whoever came wanted information, not coin, and that told me more than any note could have. I found Beck at the clock tower an hour later and shoved the royal coin into his chest hard enough that he had to catch it. Somebody searched my home, I said. Somebody called you a king. Somebody just told his friend they're going to use me against you. I want the truth, right now, or I'm done. He looked at me for a long moment, weighing something behind his eyes, and then he reached beneath his collar and pulled out a chain I'd never seen. A black ring hung from it, engraved with a wolf circling a crown, the same mark worn thin on his coin. My name is Beckett Rowe, he said. I am the Alpha King of the Northern Crown Territories. I hit him. I didn't decide to. My hand moved before my mind caught up, and the crack of it against his jaw echoed off the stone tower loud enough that two guards stepped forward before he raised a hand and stopped them cold. Was any of it real? My voice cracked in a way I hated. The hunger, the coat, the coming back every morning. Was I just a performance you were watching? The first loaf was a test, he admitted. I needed to see this district the way it actually behaves when it doesn't know a crown is watching. And after the first loaf? After that, he said, I came back because your stall was the only place in this kingdom where someone looked at me and saw neither a crown nor a use for one. I wanted that to be enough. It wasn't not yet. Why here? I said. Out of every failing district in your territories, why Cedar Hollow? He hesitated long enough that I knew whatever came next would cost him. Royal scent trackers found the signature of a fated bond one believed I'd never have, he said. It led here. To you. The words landed somewhere between my ribs and my throat and sat there, heavy, unwelcome. So I'm not a person to you, I said. I'm a scent match, a biological answer to a problem your bloodline needed solved. That is not why I kept coming back, he said, and for the first time since I'd known him, his voice actually shook. The bond told me where to look. It never told me what I'd find worth staying for. I didn't answer that. I couldn't. Not with my hand still stinging and my chest still burning with the memory of every question he'd asked me under false pretenses. He told me the rest anyway, because he must have understood that half a confession wasn't going to be enough to keep me standing there. The grain wagons that were supposed to be arriving from the northern farms, the ones the district records claimed had never stopped, had actually been signed into Cedar Hollow under one name for the last several deliveries. My mother's name, Marin Whitlock, dead 17 years, apparently still signing for grain shipments that never arrived. Someone inside the palace knew exactly where I was going before I ever left, he said. And whoever that is has been using your mother's name to move stolen grain since before either of us were old enough to understand what any of this meant. I stood there in the wreckage of my own bakery, holding a coin from a king I'd fed like a beggar, staring at a man who'd just told me my dead mother's name was still being used as a lie. "I came here searching for corruption," Beck said quietly. "Someone else sent me here searching for you." Chapter 5. I agreed to help him on 3 conditions, and I made him repeat them back to me before I believed he meant to keep them. He would not lock me away in the name of protecting me. He would hand over every piece of evidence that touched my family, whole and unfiltered. And he would never use whatever this bond between us was supposed to mean as a claim on my choices. He agreed to all 3 without arguing, which surprised me more than if he'd fought me on it. We spent 2 days going through my bakery receipts side by side, matching delivery dates against the district's official grain logs. The numbers didn't just fail to match. They contradicted each other in a pattern too consistent to be an accident. Grain that was logged as delivered from the northern farms never actually crossed into Cedar Hollow at all. On one of the older receipts, tucked in the corner where the ink had nearly faded, I found a tiny mark shaped like a sprig of rosemary. My mother used to draw that exact symbol in the margins of her recipes, a habit I'd never once questioned. We followed the delivery routes on the map until they ran cold at the mouth of an old mining tunnel outside town, abandoned for longer than I've been alive, or so the district always claimed. It wasn't abandoned. Dressed as delivery workers, we walked into a tunnel-stacked floor to ceiling with sacks of grain, crates of medicine, and bundles of ration cards waiting to be sold across the border. Wexler wasn't just stealing taxes. He was manufacturing the very hunger he pretended to be fighting, buying up bankrupt farms for pennies once their owners had nothing left to sell. Being that close to him in that narrow space did something to my body I couldn't control. My sense spiked from fear and fury tangled together, and Beck's whole frame went taut beside me, his instincts answering mine before either of us gave permission. He put one hand flat against the tunnel wall beside my head, close enough that I felt the heat off his skin, and he didn't move any closer than that. "May I help?" he asked. I told him yes. He let just enough of his scent loose to settle mine. Nothing forced, nothing taken. It was the most intimate thing anyone had done for me in years, and he hadn't even touched me to do it. Later, hiding from a passing guard in a storage alcove barely wide enough for one person, we ended up pressed together in the dark, his mouth a breath from mine. I felt the decision building in both of us at once. I almost let it happen. He almost let it happen. A guard's boots scraped past the opening, and we froze until the sound faded, and the moment we'd both been leaning toward slipped away with it. I told myself it was for the best. I didn't fully believe it. Deeper in the tunnel, we found a stack of transfer documents stamped with a private seal I didn't recognize. Beck went pale looking at it. "That's Sterling Maddox's seal," he said. "He's been my advisor since I was a boy. He raised me after my father died. He wouldn't be part of this." I copied the seal onto a scrap of paper before we left, because I've learned that the people everyone trusts without question are usually the ones worth watching closest. When I got home that night, Hollis was sitting by the fire with a folded letter in his lap. The moment he saw me, he threw it straight into the flames. I asked him what it said. He told me it was nothing, his voice too fast, his scent thick with a fear he couldn't hide from me even if he wanted to. After he went to bed, I pulled the half-burned edges out of the hearth with a poker before the fire finished the job. Most of it was ash. One line survived. "Bring us the king's blood, or your brother inherits your mother's sentence." Chapter 6. Hollis wouldn't look at me when I asked about the letter, and that told me everything the ashes couldn't. I held the burned scrap out between us, close enough to the candlelight that neither of us could pretend the words weren't there. He stared at the floor instead of at me, his jaw tight, his scent thick with a fear he couldn't hide no matter how hard he tried. "I don't know what that is," he said. I wanted to press him. I wanted to shake the truth loose from him the way I've shaken flour from a sack 100 times. But I've learned that fear doesn't answer to force, only to patience, so I let it go for the night and carried the weight of it to bed with me instead. Beck offered the next morning to move both of us into a guarded house near the Capitol Road. I said no before he finished the sentence. Leaving the bakery empty would tell whoever searched it that they'd rattled us, and I refused to hand them that satisfaction. We spent the day going through the copied seal and the tunnel documents instead, laying them side by side on my kitchen table like pieces of a puzzle neither of us wanted finished. The land transfers all led to the same shell companies, and every one of those companies traced back to accounts controlled by Sterling Maddox. Beck went still reading it, the kind of stillness that comes right before something breaks. Maddox raised me, he said. After my father died, he was the only person who never wanted anything from me. Betrayal doesn't mean your trust was foolish, I told him. It means he wasn't worth it. He didn't answer that right away. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped into something rawer than I'd heard from him before. Why do you keep giving away food you need for yourself? I hadn't planned to tell him, but it came out anyway. Years ago, a traveler had come through starving, and I'd kept the last of our bread back for my mother instead of giving it to him. He died outside town that same night. I've carried that weight every day since, baked it into every loaf I've handed out for free. Compassion isn't payment for every life you couldn't save, Beck said. Something in the way he said it told me he understood guilt the same way I did, carried in private and never fully set down. Our scents filled the small kitchen as the candle burned low. He reached up and touched my cheek, slow enough that I could have stopped him, and I didn't. His thumb traced the line of my jaw like he was memorizing it. I can't start something with you while you're still holding pieces of the truth back, I said. He nodded and dropped his hand, and he didn't argue, which told me more about him than any kiss could have. A brick came through the front window before either of us could say anything else. It landed hard on the floorboards, wrapped in cloth stained dark with something I didn't want to name. Tied around it was a severed rosemary branch and a note scrawled in uneven letters. The next loaf feeds a king his death. I ran straight for the medicine cabinet where I keep what little we have, and found the lock already broken, the poison vial gone from the shelf. Hollis wasn't in his room. I searched the house twice before I understood he wasn't just out walking. He was gone, and he'd left no note, no sign, nothing except an empty space where his boots usually sat by the door. Wexler's voice rang out through the square the next morning, loud enough to draw a crowd, accusing me publicly of hiding stolen grain in my own bakery. I didn't have time to answer him. A palace messenger arrived within the hour carrying a sealed order from Maddox himself, commanding Beck to return to the capital immediately, no explanation given. Beck read it once and folded it slowly, his face unreadable in a way that frightened me more than anger would have. I climbed the stairs of the old clock tower that evening looking for anywhere quiet enough to think, and found blood on the steps instead, dark and still fresh. Beneath it, half hidden in the shadow of the stone, sat a small glass vial with Beckett's name written across the label in a hand I didn't recognize. Chapter 7. The men who found me at the stall the next morning didn't bother pretending to be customers. They told me Hollis was alive, chained somewhere in the mines, and that he would stay that way only as long as I did exactly what they said. I was to mix poison into Beckett's rosemary bread during his next public visit. If I refused, my brother would die, and the forged charge of treason against our mother would fall onto both our names, sealing our fate before a council that had already decided to hate us. I told them yes before they finished threatening me. Back in the bakery, alone, I mixed the poison exactly as instructed, then added a heavy dose of concentrated rosemary oil on top of it, strong enough that anyone who knew my baking would catch the wrongness the second it hit the air. I coated the soles of my boots in flour before I left, leaving a pale trail behind me with every step, thin enough to miss unless you were looking, clear enough to follow if you knew me. Beck noticed the altered scent the moment I handed him the loaf. His eyes found mine, sharp and questioning, and for one heartbeat I thought he understood exactly what I'd done and why. Then his guards closed in around me from every side. "Seize him," Beck said, his voice carrying across the square, cold and flat and utterly convincing. "This Omega has attempted to poison your king." The crowd gasped. Chains locked around my wrists before I could process what was happening. I looked at his face, searching for some sign that this was still part of a plan we'd made together, and found nothing there but contempt. So complete it felt real even though I'd helped build it myself. They dragged me toward a transport carriage while Wexler watched from the edge of the square. Smiling the same smile he'd worn the day he crushed my bread beneath his boot. Inside the carriage, once the door shut and the noise of the crowd faded, I found a lockpick tucked into the seam of my sleeve, exactly where Beck must have hidden it before the arrest. The relief lasted only a moment before the hurt came rushing back in behind it. The chains had been our idea. The disgust in his voice, the way he'd looked at me like something scraped off his boot, that hadn't needed to be part of any plan. He could have arrested me without making me believe, even for a second, that everything between us had been nothing but a performance from the start. I picked the lock the moment the carriage slowed on a bend in the road, slipped out into the trees, and followed my own flower trail back toward the mines where they were holding Hollis. What I found there broke something in me I hadn't braced for. Hollis stood in an open chamber, unchained, talking easily with one of Wexler's men like they'd known each other for months. No fear in his posture. No sign of a prisoner. He looked up and saw me in the doorway, and his face didn't show relief or panic. It showed guilt. "You were never supposed to discover what Mother did," he said. I stood frozen, staring at my own brother standing free among the men who were supposed to be holding him captive, my mind racing through every strange silence, every burned letter, every excuse he'd given me over the past weeks, and none of it made sense the way I thought it had. Chapter 8. Hollis didn't wait for me to ask again before the truth started spilling out of him. He told me he'd been feeding false information to Wexler's men for months, not because he'd turned against me, but because he was trying to protect me. Maddox had shown him documents claiming our mother had committed treason, and Hollis believed that if I ever found those papers myself, I'd confront the Crown directly and be executed for it. He thought silence would keep me alive. Then he'd discovered the documents were forged. Our mother had never been a traitor. She'd been a royal auditor, sent north 17 years ago to investigate the very grain network Wexler was still running today. She'd hidden her findings inside her recipes, encoding warehouse numbers and stolen quantities into the measurements of flour and water and rosemary, because she knew paper records could be altered but a family recipe never would be questioned. She'd been in direct contact with Beck's mother, Queen Laurel Rowe, who had wanted to end the alpha sponsorship laws entirely and give Omegas the right to own property on their own names. Both women had died before either plan could reach the council floor. Neither death had been an accident. Maddox had arranged both, long before Beckett ever wore a crown. I didn't have time to feel the full weight of that before Wexler's voice echoed through the chamber behind me, ordering his men to kill Hollis on the spot now that the truth was out. I grabbed a lantern off the wall and swung it hard against a support beam, shattering the glass and sending burning oil across the dry planks. Flour dust hung thick in the tunnel air from the broken sacks stacked against the walls, and I used it, throwing handfuls into the fire until the whole chamber filled with a choking white cloud, enough to blind without enough density to explode. In the confusion, Beck arrived, following the same flour trail I'd left for him, and we fought side by side rather than him simply pulling me to safety. I have never forgotten the sight of him moving through smoke and chaos like it was second nature, or the way he put himself between Hollis and a crossbow bolt meant for my brother's chest. The bolt caught Beck instead, high in the shoulder, and he staggered but didn't fall. Wexler escaped in the confusion with the coded ledger clutched to his chest, believing he'd won. I tore a strip from my own shirt and pressed it against Beck's wound while he sat against the tunnel wall, his breathing ragged, his eyes never leaving my face. "I'm sorry," he said, "for the chains, for the way I looked at you. An apology doesn't undo an order I was never given a say in." I told him and meant it, even as my hands kept working to stop his bleeding. Back at the bakery, cleaning the wound properly by candlelight, I noticed the skin around it had turned an unnatural shade, and a healer I trusted confirmed what I feared. The bolt had been coated in a scent-suppressing toxin, slow-acting, designed to weaken an alpha's instincts over days rather than kill him outright. Searching through what remained of my mother's stolen recipe book, which Hollis had managed to recover during the chaos, I found a single page that didn't match the rest, tucked into the binding like it had been hidden there on purpose. It was a copy of the very document that had condemned my mother, and at the bottom, plain as day, sat a royal signature. It belonged to Beckett. Chapter 9. I walked into the tribunal chamber in chains I'd asked for myself, and the whole room mistook my calm for surrender. Wexler stood first, presenting his forged ledger to the full Northern Council, claiming I had poisoned the king and that my mother had stolen grain from the crown 17 years ago. Maddox stood beside Beck's throne wearing the face of a loyal advisor, his voice smooth and grieved, subtly steering the council towards stripping Beck of his authority for failing to control his own territories. The signature on the condemning document was raised as final proof. I asked for permission to speak, and when it was granted, I explained that the signature did belong to Beckett, but it had been placed on a ceremonial document when he was 14 years old, long before he held any real power to authorize land transfers or shell companies. Maddox had used a child's signature to launder his own crimes. Maddox's composure cracked for the first time since I'd known of him. He told the council that a kingdom built on Omega independence could not survive, that he had created the poverty across these districts on purpose, to force families back under Alpha control where he believed they belonged. He called me an ignorant bread seller who had stumbled into matters far beyond my understanding. I laid out everything on the table in front of the full council. My mother's coded recipes. Years of bakery receipts matched against falsified grain logs. The property transfers signed under fake names. The ration card denials used to strangle packless households. Wexler's own instructions for the poisoning, written in his hand. Testimony from families who had lost their farms to his shell companies. And the royal seal I had copied in the tunnel with my own fingers. You believed hunger would make us obedient, I said. Instead it taught us to count everything. Maddox ordered the council guards to seize Beck, but Captain Nash stepped forward and revealed he'd already identified which guards had taken payment from the stolen grain network. Those loyal to the crown turned their weapons on Maddox's men instead. Wexler tried to bolt for the chamber doors and found them blocked by a crowd of Cedar Hollow villagers holding matching receipts, refusing to let him pass. Beck didn't take credit for any of it. He stood before the full council and admitted that the crown had failed this district long before Wexler ever exploited it, and he ordered every stolen farm, every stolen coin, and every stolen ration returned in full. Maddox and Wexler were both arrested before the sun set. Afterward, I tried to leave without speaking to Beck privately, because I didn't trust myself to stay steady if I looked at him too long. He found me anyway in an empty corridor, and he didn't command me to stop. He simply waited. I love you, I told him, and it terrified me to say it out loud. Not because you're king. Because I've spent my whole life disappearing into what other people need, and I refuse to disappear into yours, even though every part of me wants to. He told me he didn't want me beneath him or behind him or wrapped in false protection. He wanted me beside him exactly as I was. He cupped my face and waited, giving me every chance to step back. I closed the distance myself. The kiss started slow, both of us testing whether trust could survive everything we'd put each other through, and then his control broke and mine went with it, and the corridor filled with the mixed scent of rosemary, warm bread, cedar, and iron. His ring brushed against my mother's pendant as we finally pulled apart, and a second crest flared to life beneath the metal, one neither of us recognized. Captain Nash, standing at the end of the hall, went pale at the sight of it. That symbol belongs to the lost Omega crown, he said. Chapter 10. The royal archivist confirmed within a week that my mother's bloodline traced directly back to the Whitlock Omega dynasty, a royal line erased from the official records generations ago after they opposed the forced bonding laws that still choked half the territories. That meant I held a legitimate claim to an independent seat on the Northern Council. I refused to use it as proof that I deserved dignity. No Omega should need royal blood in their veins to own property, to receive medicine, or to control their own bond. Beck agreed, and within days he signed the first wave of reforms into law. Independent property ownership for Omegas. Ration access without needing an Alpha's name attached. A full review of coercive bonding contracts across every territory. Restitution for every family who'd lost land to Wexler's schemes. Regular audits of every rural district, so no governor could quietly starve his own people again. A council seat elected directly by the districts that had been ignored the longest. And funding set aside for Hollis to finally get the education he'd sacrificed everything to protect for me. Beck offered me gold and a room in the palace. I turned both down. I wasn't leaving the bakery that raised me, and he never asked me to again. I accepted the title of Crown Auditor for the Outer Territories instead, keeping Cedar Hollow as my home and my base, exactly where I belonged. That night, once the chaos of council business had finally quieted, Beck and I returned to the bakery alone. He let his scent loose fully for the first time since I'd met him, no suppressant, no restraint, and he asked me plainly if I wanted him to stop. I didn't want him to stop. What happened between us that night wasn't him overtaking me, and it wasn't me losing myself to instinct. It was a choice, made slowly, with his hand steady against my jaw and his voice checking in with every step, making sure I was choosing him back at every single moment. He marked my throat gently, without forming any permanent bond, because I'd asked him to wait until I decided I wanted that outside the middle of a crisis neither of us had chosen. I asked him not to hide from me anymore, not as a king and not as a man, and he promised he wouldn't. Weeks later, as I packed for my first council journey, doubt crept in anyway. He hadn't come back to the bakery since the night of the tribunal, and some old part of me, the part raised on scraps and disappointment, wondered if all of this had only existed because of the crisis that built it. At dawn, a copper coin appeared on my counter. Beck stood on the other side. No guards, no crown, no ceremonial robes, just the same torn coat he'd worn the first morning I ever fed him. "One loaf," he said. I handed him the bread, the same way I had the very first time. "It was never Cedar Hollow I was searching for," he told me. "Then stop searching," I said, and stepped around my own stall to kiss him in front of the whole waking street. Before we left for the capital, Hollis found one final line hidden in the binding of our mother's recipe book, written in her own careful hand. She had known I carried the lost royal crest long before I ever did. And she had written one more thing, something even she never lived to finish investigating. One surviving member of the old Omega Crown had escaped the massacre that erased our bloodline, and that person was still alive, somewhere inside the capital, waiting to be found. I had believed the king came to Cedar Hollow to test my heart. By the time we left the bakery for good, I understood that my mother had spent 17 years preparing me to test the kingdoms. Epilogue. The road to the capital took 4 days, and I spent most of it staring out the carriage window instead of sleeping, turning my mother's last words over and over until they wore smooth in my mind like a stone carried too long in a pocket. One surviving member of the old Omega Crown had escaped the massacre, still alive, somewhere inside the capital. Beck rode beside the carriage most of the way rather than inside it, saying he needed the cold air to keep his head clear, but I knew the truth. He was giving me room to sit with what my mother had left behind without an alpha's presence crowding the grief and the wonder crashing through me in equal measure. Hollis rode across from me instead, quieter than I'd ever known him to be, flipping through the recipe book like it might yield one more secret if he stared at it long enough. "She never told either of us," he said somewhere around the second day. Not really a question, more a wound he was pressing on to see if it still hurt. "She was protecting us," I said. "The same way you thought you were protecting me." He didn't answer that, but something in his shoulders eased, like being compared to her instead of blamed for his silence was a kindness he hadn't expected. The capital rose out of the hills on the third evening, all white stone and copper roofs catching the last of the sun, bigger than anything Cedar Hollow could have prepared me for. I had grown up hearing about it the way people speak of places they'll never actually see, a rumor with towers. Standing at the gates with Beck's hand resting light at the small of my back, I felt every bit the bread seller I still was, even wrapped in the traveling coat the council had insisted I wear. The palace itself was worse. Or better, I suppose, depending on how you measured worth by ceiling height and gold leaf. I kept catching myself flinching at servants who bowed to me, at guards who called me by a title I hadn't grown into yet. Crown Auditor, Whitlock. Words that used to belong to a dead woman's ledger now apparently belonged to me. Beck gave me 2 days to settle before council business started in earnest, and I used every hour of it chasing down my mother's last line instead of resting. Captain Nash was the one who finally pointed me somewhere useful. He'd served the crown long enough to remember whispers most people had let fade, and when I asked him plainly whether he knew anything about a hidden survivor of the old Omega Crown, his face did something careful and complicated. "There's a woman," he said, "keeps a shop near the lower quarter. Herbs mostly. Records too, if you know to ask and she decides she likes you. She's been there longer than anyone can account for. Nobody's ever pressed her on her age or her name before she came to that shop." He wouldn't say more than that, not because he didn't trust me, but because some habits of silence outlive the reasons for them. I found the shop on the 4th morning, tucked between a cobbler and a bakery that smelled nothing like mine, and the woman behind the counter looked up when the bell over the door rang like she'd been waiting for it her whole life. She was old in the way that makes age hard to guess, silver hair pinned back plain, hands steady despite the lines mapped across them. Her eyes went straight to the pendant at my throat before they ever reached my face. "You have her mouth," she said, before I'd introduced myself at all. "Marin's." Same stubborn set to it when she was deciding whether to trust someone. My knees nearly went out from under me right there on her floor. Her name was Odile, and she told me, once she'd locked the shop door and pulled the shades, that she had been a girl of 19 the night the old Omega crown fell, hidden inside a grain cart by a nursemaid who did not survive the night herself. She had spent the better part of 60 years disguised as nothing more than a shopkeeper, watching the throne from a careful distance, waiting for a reason to believe it was safe to be more than that again. She had known my mother, not as a stranger passing through, but as a friend, one of only a handful of people who knew what Marin truly was before the crown ever sent her north to audit a corruption network that would eventually cost her life. She used to come here when the council sessions ran late, Odile said. Sat right where you're sitting now. Told me once that she was tired of hiding what she was, but that hiding kept her children safe, and that was worth more to her than any crown ever could be. I asked her why she had never come forward herself, not even after my mother died. Not even now that the corruption that killed her had finally been exposed. She was quiet for a long moment before she answered. Because crowns make people into symbols before they let them be people, she said. I watched what that did to your mother. I wasn't in a hurry to volunteer for the same fate. I understood that better than I wanted to. I had spent my whole life being reduced to what I could provide. First to Wexler as a source of coin, then briefly to Beck as a scent match his bloodline needed solved. I had fought hard to be seen as more than either of those things. I recognized the same fight sitting across the counter from me in an old woman's careful eyes. I told her she didn't have to become anything she didn't choose to be, that the reforms Beck and I had pushed through weren't built to force anyone back into a role they'd spent a lifetime escaping, that whatever she decided, the offer would remain open, not a demand. Something in her face softened at that, like she'd been braced for a different kind of visit and was relieved to have been wrong. She gave me something before I left that day. A small wooden box, its hinges rusted nearly solid, containing letters my mother had written to her over the years, some from before I was born, some from the months right before her death. I read them alone in my room that night by candlelight, and in them I found a version of my mother I had never known. Frightened sometimes, doubtful of her own choices, fiercely, endlessly certain that whatever she uncovered would matter more than whatever it cost her. One letter, dated only months before she died, held a line that undid something in my chest I hadn't realized was still tightly wound. If anything happens to me, tell my sons that love built out of truth is worth more than safety built out of silence. I have given them silence to keep them alive. I hope one day they choose truth instead, even when it costs them more than I ever had to pay. I carried that letter to Beck that same night, and I read it aloud to him with my voice breaking more than once, and when I finished he didn't try to comfort me with words. He simply held me until the shaking stopped, and that was enough. The following weeks blurred together in a way that felt more like living than any single day in Cedar Hollow ever had. Wexler stood trial before the full council and was stripped of his title. His lands returned to the families he'd stolen them from, his fate left to a justice system that, for the first time in longer than I'd been alive, actually applied its laws evenly. Maddox's trial ran longer and uglier, dragging half the palace's old secrets into daylight along with him. But in the end, the same evidence I had laid on the tribunal floor held firm under every challenge his lawyers raised. Hollis started his studies within the month, placed under tutors who treated his sharp mind like an asset instead of a threat, and I watched years of quiet fear slowly ease out of his shoulders as he realized nobody was going to punish him anymore for being clever. Odile came to the Capitol Council session the day the final reforms were formally recorded into law, standing quietly at the back of the chamber in a plain gray dress, unnoticed by anyone who didn't already know what she carried in her blood. She caught my eye once, across the whole crowded room, and gave me the smallest nod I have ever received, the kind that says more than any speech could. Beck and I did not rush toward any grand ceremony, and I was grateful for that more than I could have said out loud. We built our life slower than that, deliberately, the way you build something meant to last rather than something meant to impress a crowd. I split my time between the Capitol, where my duties as Crown Auditor kept me busy untangling the same kinds of corruption that had nearly buried Cedar Hollow, and the bakery, which I refused to let fall into disrepair no matter how many council sessions demanded my presence elsewhere. Some mornings Beck came with me back to Cedar Hollow, trading his ceremonial coat for the same torn one he'd worn the day we met, standing behind my counter handing out bread to customers who had no idea their king was serving them rosemary loaves with his own two hands. He told me once that those mornings were the only hours in his whole life that felt like they belonged entirely to him and not to the crown balanced on his head the rest of the time. I believed him completely, because I had watched his shoulders drop the exact same way mine did whenever I stepped back behind that same counter. The bond between us deepened slowly, the way trust is supposed to grow rather than the way instinct wanted to force it. When I finally chose to complete it, months after that first night in the bakery, it was a decision made in quiet daylight rather than the middle of any crisis, made with a clear head and a steady heart, exactly the way I had told him I needed it to be. He asked me one more time, even then, if I was certain, and I told him I had never been more certain of anything in my life. Hollis stood as witness. Odile stood beside him. Captain Nash guarded the door out of old habit more than necessity, since for the first time in longer than any of us could remember, there was no threat left standing that required guarding against. My mother's pendant never stopped carrying its second crest, and in time the historians of the realm folded the Whitlock name back into the official records, not as a footnote or a tragedy, but as a lineage that had endured exactly long enough to help set right what had been broken in its absence. I think about her constantly, more now than I ever did while I believed her only legacy was an old brick oven and a set of unpaid debts. I understand now that she left me far more than that. She left me a blueprint for how to survive corruption without becoming hollow inside it, how to give without losing myself in the giving, and how to love someone with the whole of my chosen heart without ever handing over the parts of myself that make me who I am. Cedar Hollow is not a wealthy district even now, though it no longer starves the way it once did, and the farms that were failing when I was a boy selling half loaves out of desperation are slowly finding their footing again under fairer laws and honest oversight. I still stand behind my stall most mornings the crown allows me, still measuring flour and water by memory instead of scale, still tucking a sprig of rosemary into every loaf the way my mother taught me, a small act of remembrance that has outlived every person who tried to erase where it came from. Beck still pays with the same copper coin every single time, worn smoother now than it was the first morning he set it on my counter, and I still hand him the bread the same way I did back when I believed he was nothing more than a hungry stranger sheltering beneath a broken clock tower. Some habits are worth keeping exactly as they started, no matter how much everything around them changes. If this story stayed with you, make sure you're subscribed and that your notifications are turned on, because there's another story coming to this channel soon, and I don't want you to miss it. Drop a comment and tell me which part of this journey hit you the hardest, whether it was the bread, the betrayal, or the crown neither of us ever expected to carry. And if this gave you something worth holding on to today, share it with someone who might need that same reminder. The end.